World War II destroyed the Italian spirit. Italy, a country ravaged by fighting, shelling, and an overthrown dictatorship, found it very difficult to get back on its feet once the proverbial dust had settled. The Italian cultural identity was severely in question. The war left the people of Italy confused and conflicted, horrified by what had transpired across Europe. Like any resilient culture, though, they sought to make sense of their changing world through their art, and thus Italian Neo-Realist film was born. Neo-realism was a style pioneered by Visconti, Rossellini, and De Sica that focused on ordinary people, usually played by non-actors or new actors, shot on location, usually encompassing stories about lower and working-class people in Italy in an effort to contextualize their struggle as well as represent the greater confusion around Italian identity post-World War II. Though many formal elements remained consistent through the Neo-Realist movement, it has been said that it has no real formal guidelines, described in Charles L. Leavitt's book on the subject as malleable, elastic, changing, and kaleidoscopic. Just over a decade later, filmmakers Michelangelo Antonioni and Federico Fellini would pioneer another Italian cinematic movement, one that continued to build off of Neo-Realism, using the old works as both a touchstone and a reactionary element to conflict with. Thus, Italian Modernist film was brought about. Modernism, as defined by Peter Child's book on the subject, is experimental, formally complex, elliptical, and tends to associate with notions of the artist's freedom from realism, materialism, traditional genre and form, with notions of cultural apocalypse. Aside from the distancing itself from realism, this ideology fits alongside Visconti and De Sica's original ideas for what Italian neo-realism could be. Unlike its neo-realist ilk, however, Italian modernism made wide use of movie stars, especially Marcello Mastroianni and Monica Vitti, both of whom were frequent collaborators of Antonioni, and remarkably popular. The modernist filmmakers turned this to their advantage, using their star power to take the audience off guard with challenging, often ambiguous storytelling, and a focus on atmosphere and tone over the traditional narrative, again, in an effort to make sense of a new world. In the economic slump brought about by World War II, Italy went about fixing it the wrong way. Due to efforts to rebuild the economy, the northern sects of Italy began to see an industrial boom that, while effective, led to many southern Italians being left behind in a state of abject poverty and rampant crime. This division of the country led to class-based resentment and disenfranchisement, ideas that modernist filmmakers tried to tackle, mainly by critiquing and displaying the hypocrisy of the Italian bourgeoisie of the time, rather than laying bare the plight of the working class. Italian modernism was the antithesis to neo-realism, yet also served a very similar purpose in the Italian zeitgeist. Now, many years later and in the Western Hemisphere, this sentiment of a country divided, of escalating tensions, and a world brought culturally and economically to its knees seems a lot more striking and poignant, and familiar. The same was evidently the thoughts of comedian Aziz Ansari when he created the television show Master of None. Master of None Season 1 follows our lead Dev, a fairly well-off actor in New York City, as he goes through the relatable trials and tribulations of an early 30-something Indian hipster. Relationships, casual racism at work, old people, sexism, the list goes on. Many found it very enjoyable, many found it very slow. With such a relatable premise and enough money and a green light from Netflix for a second season, Ansari left for Italy to come up with a concept. What we got was a blend of Italian neo-realism and Italian modernism that blew away television audiences and critics, but it wasn't all homage. Ansari had harnessed the philosophy, narrative, and thematic traits as well as the theory of these movements, not just their visual flair. What he created could be argued is neo-realist, and since it's television, it has the opportunity, 10 opportunities in fact, to be many things. What Ansari made is also a perfect use of modernism in the overtly Italian sense. Master of None not only pastiches Italian post-war cinema, but is in fact the natural continuation of these movements. 5 episodes in particular bring to mind specific neo-realist and modernist roots. So, without further ado, the first episode of Season 2 is the most obvious allusion to an individual film. Not satisfied with transitioning briefly to black and white, or having a remarkably similar title, Dev wakes up in Modena, Italy with a stack of Criterions next to his bed, quite prominently included Bicycle Thieves. The references to Bicycle Thieves continue with the narrative of the episode, following Dev as he goes on an impromptu date, gets the woman's number, then has his phone stolen, and spends the rest of the film running around with a kid, the grandson of the owner of the pasta shop he works at, trying to retrieve it, only to arrive at the home of the thief and have his neighborhood band together to protect him. This is almost exactly the plot of Bicycle Thieves. The episode even employs the film's soundtrack briefly, and mimics one specific moment in Bicycle Thieves when, after losing his bike, Ricci is suddenly surrounded by bicyclists.
fuck that guy kiss his phone for?
At one point in the episode, Dev inadvertently steals another man's phone, which is an obvious allusion to the conclusion of Bicycle Thieves. This episode most directly pastiches the visual and narrative styles of Neo-Realism, but already there are less formal elements at play as well. The episode is shot entirely on location in Italy, something not many half-hour television comedies are willing to do. The episode is focused around a small town on working-class people as Dev takes a break from his usual bourgeois lifestyle to work in a pasta shop. The episode also tackles an element of modern life, and that being our reliance on technology, comparing the idea of losing your phone to Ricci in Bicycle Thieves losing his bicycle. Though the situations are in no way comparable, the reactions of Ricci and Dev are similarly intense, and their disappointment when faced with the reality that they can't get their property back is equally dejected. Especially when put in the context of the rest of the series and what Dev's normal life in New York is like, I think this comment stresses how reliant people have become on technology in their lives, and how easy it is to lose sight of the big picture, the actual people who suffer, the ones that films like Bicycle Thieves and their ilk highlight. A few episodes later in the series comes a run of 2 episodes that perfectly encapsulate the neo-realist sentiment. Neither episode features Dev as the main character, and both demonstrate the plight of different disenfranchised members of society. First is New York I Love You, an anthology story connecting the stories of a deaf cashier at a bodega, a group of recently immigrated cab drivers, and an overworked doorman, all of whom feel disappointed with their lot in life. Like its neo-realist ilk, the episode is shot almost entirely on location and realistically depicts the harsh or otherwise unpleasant experience of those who society treats with less kindness. The first segment about the deaf cashier is entirely silent, creating a forced empathy and understanding between the audience and characters that is very compelling, and a good example of neo-realism, creating the conditions of reality in a nearly documentary manner to, as put by Godfrey Cheshire in their 2007 Criterion essay, represent the struggle for authenticity and political engagement in cinema. The following episode, Thanksgiving, was written by its star Lena Waithe. Waithe was not originally an actor, but a writer and close friend of Ansari. At his request, she appears in the show as a reoccurring character, Denise, who presents as very similar to Lena's actual personality, a self-professed masculine-presenting lesbian woman, and a vocal advocate for LGBTQ causes. This is not the only time Ansari has requested non-actors appear in his show to play similar versions of themselves. The actors who appear as Dev's parents in the show are actually Aziz Ansari's parents. His father a doctor by profession, but after appearing in season 1 of Master of None, he could be seen on for your consideration billboards around Hollywood. This choice to have non-actors play roles similar to their real lives is directly out of the neo-realist playbook, something DeSica famously did in Bicycle Thieves to great effect. The episode, Thanksgiving, follows several years of family Thanksgiving at Denise's house, some of which Dev attends, as Denise comes to terms with her sexuality, how to approach it with her family, and with her partners as they join her at the Thanksgiving table. It's a poignant and deeply empathetic episode, likely due in part to Lena having co-written it with Ansari, and its location shooting, non-actor roles, and its narrative revolving around a societally disenfranchised person all speak to its commitment to the neo-realist theory. As the season moves on, it begins to return to the kinds of storylines we had in the first season, often following Dev and his friends around New York City, and given Dev's career and lifestyle, it begins to shift away from the neo-realist roots displayed in the first episode and the various other episodes that don't focus on Dev. Here is where Italian modernism becomes an element at play. Through 3 episodes specifically, a love story involving Dev and a friend from his time in Italy, Francesca, plays out. Francesca is engaged to a man named Pino, who evidently is not a great suit for her. When they come to New York City to visit Dev and Pino is constantly preoccupied with work, Dev and Francesca begin to dance around their attraction to each other and step around the moral ambiguity of their actions as they get closer. This concept of moral ambiguity is something oft explored in modernist films, as the characters within try to reconcile their higher-class lifestyles with the destruction and poverty that still gripped the south of the country and the industrial lands that populated the north. In addition, the infidelity in the love story with Dev and Francesca is reminiscent of the storyline of L'Avventura, a film they even watch in this episode. In L'Avventura, a group of travelers go to an island, 2 of them a couple, and the woman disappears. Her friend and her boyfriend go off in search of her, but instead end up falling in love, and all but abandoning the search for her in lieu of pursuing their own affair. Much like this, while the real storyline of these last few episodes is about Dev's cooking show, we all but forget about its existence, or Francesca's fiancé's existence, instead being swept along in their romance. There is an element of visual pastiche in this episode. During a sequence in which Dev and Francesca watch L'Avventura, there is a brief dream sequence in which Dev imagines himself and Francesca in the positions of the characters within the film, making the similarities in the narrative even clearer as well. Couple these elements with visual references to 8.5 and Le Cliché, and the picture of the modernist sensibility Ansari was aiming for becomes crystal clear. The final episode of Master of None continues the same thematic elements of Amar's Yunpo, but contributes two new things to the table that truly drive home the modernist roots. First of all, there is an extended dream sequence near the beginning that pictures Francesca literally ripping Dev's heart out, and a cameo by an extra from a previous episode for no apparent reason, eating a rib. This sequence is not specifically a callback to any particular modernist work, but it does stick out as the only fantasy sequence so far in the show. As discussed earlier, modernist works are often described as experimental, formally complex, elliptical, and this dream sequence is a clear depiction of that style, breaking from its realistic nature to deliver an emotional gut punch direct from Dev's subconscious. Following it with a match cut hammers home its formal complexity, delving even deeper into the modernist influence. Finally, and most clearly modernist, is the show's ending. Many of the 1960s Italian films that Master of None references end on ambiguous notes, a reflection of the uncertain world and time in which they were made. In a world that makes nearly as little sense to the Westerners of today as it did to the Europeans of the mid-century, it makes perfect sense to likewise end Master of None's second season on an ambiguous note. Francesca and Dev have argued, split, and she's gone home to Pino to return to Italy with him. Her decision is left uncertain, and then we cut back. After cutting to black, we fade in on Dev lying in his bed, and as we pan up, it is revealed that next to him is Francesca. But neither of them look happy, and then it ends. All the tension and pressure left on the thinnest of a dangling thread up to our own interpretation. It doesn't make sense, which is precisely what both the Italian filmmakers of the 60s and Ansari wanted to hammer home. Nothing makes sense, so why should this? Establishing the precedent for dream sequences within the show makes the ending especially difficult to nail down. Is it real? Is it Dev's imagination again? Why did Francesca come back? If she did, will they work out? Is this why they look unhappy? The ending raises more questions than it solves, and it lingers in the back of the mind of the audience. It is a perfectly elliptical, ambiguous, and modernist conclusion. Neo-realism and modernism are strange movements. Both were short-lived, produced very few popular works, and tended to be forgotten amongst the large-scale French and Russian movements and aesthetics of the era. But similarly, their formal styles were, to yet again quote Charles L. Levitt, malleable, elastic, changing, kaleidoscopic. Only someone with a deep appreciation and understanding of such a formally flexible movement could manage to not only continue their legacy through visual reference and homage, but truly encapsulate the themes and theory that made them influential to begin with, and keep them running for the future.
Piano.